The most important number in this conflict is no longer how many drones Iran can launch on a mine. It is how many times Iran can afford to launch them and get nothing back. That is the real story of the June 9 exchange over the Strait of Hormuz. 4 Iranian one-way attack drones lifted off from the southern coast and turned toward the most important oil choke point on Earth. They did not reach a tanker. They did not hit a warship. They did not shut down the shipping lane. They did not create mass casualties, sink a vessel, or force the United States Navy to retreat from the operating area. They died over open water. Then the battlefield reversed. American drones and fighter aircraft crossed the coastline, hit the coastal radar and communications infrastructure that supported Iran's maritime targeting picture, and degraded the very network that would have been needed to launch the next round. Iran then fired ballistic missiles at Kuwait and Bahrain. 6 were intercepted. The 7th failed to reach a meaningful target. And after all of that, after losing drones, missiles, radar nodes, and communications infrastructure, without inflicting the kind of damage that would change Washington's position, Iran declared victory. That is the entire conflict in miniature. Iran is still acting, but the action is no longer producing strategic return. It is consuming inventory, exposing infrastructure, and revealing the gap between propaganda and battlefield effect. The drones are not reaching the ships, the missiles are not hitting the bases, the radars are not staying online, the command relay nodes are being struck. The information apparatus keeps announcing triumph, but the operational reality underneath that triumph is depletion. This is not the image of a force imposing pressure. It is the image of a force spending pressure faster than it can replenish it. That distinction matters more than any single intercepted drone. Iran's strategy is not built on one successful strike. It is built on accumulation. Launch enough drones, fire enough missiles, threaten enough ships, raise enough insurance costs, exhaust enough interceptors, scare enough shipping companies, and eventually the political cost of holding the line becomes higher than the cost of negotiation. That is the logic. But that logic only works if each attack creates pressure. If each attack instead destroys Iranian inventory, reveals Iranian launch patterns, and gives the U.S. military an excuse to strike the network behind the attack, the strategy begins to reverse. The attack no longer pressures the defender. It feeds the defender a target list. That is what June 9 shows. The source describes 5 layers of the American response: find, suppress, defeat cheaply, reserve expensive interceptors for serious threats, and punch back. That sequence is not just a tactical architecture. It is a strategic philosophy. The goal is not merely to survive each Iranian attack. The goal is to turn each Iranian attack into another round of subtraction. Find the drone. Suppress the sensors. Kill the cheap threat cheaply. Save the expensive weapons for ballistic missiles. Strike the launch support network. Force Iran to spend more than it gains. Then repeat. If that cycle continues, Iran does not need to lose one giant battle. It can lose by arithmetic. Modern war is often discussed in terms of shock, firepower, range, and technology. But in a prolonged campaign, the deeper question is usually economic. Who can keep paying the cost of each exchange? Iran's drone doctrine was built around the idea that cheap one-way attack drones could impose expensive defensive responses. If a Shahed-type drone costs tens of thousands of dollars, and the defender uses a multi-million-dollar missile to kill it, the attacker wins the cost curve even when the drone dies. That was the theory. For years, it was a real problem. Cheap drones changed the air defense debate because they forced advanced militaries into a miserable choice. Either spend expensive interceptors against cheap targets or allow cheap targets to hit valuable assets. Neither option is attractive. If you intercept everything with high-end missiles, your magazine depletes and your defense becomes financially unsustainable. If you do not intercept, drones hit ships, bases, oil infrastructure, radar sites, or civilian areas. Iran understood that. Russia understood it in Ukraine. The Houthis understood it in the Red Sea. Every military watching the drone revolution understood the same basic idea. The cheap flying bomb had created a cost crisis for expensive defense systems. But the American response over Hormuz suggests that the cost crisis is being solved, or at least reduced, through layered defense. The key is not one miracle weapon. It is matching the cheapest adequate defensive tool to the threat level. Do not use a THAAD interceptor on a lawnmower engine drone. Do not use an SM-6 unless the threat requires it. Do not waste a multi-million-dollar missile on a target that a cheaper rocket, gun system, laser, or low-cost interceptor can defeat. This is how the cost curve flips. A drone that was supposed to drain expensive magazines is instead met by weapons closer to its own cost class. APKWS rockets, fighter-mounted counter-drone loadouts, close-in gun systems, shipboard lasers, electronic warfare, and low-cost drones all become part of the same answer. The defender stops treating every aerial object as a strategic missile problem and starts sorting threats by cost, speed, altitude, payload, and risk. That sorting is the revolution. The old problem was that drones forced expensive reactions. Solutions that not every drone deserves an expensive reaction. When Iran launched 4 drones on June 9, the American system had already been built around that principle. The sensor network identified them early. Maritime patrol aircraft, unmanned surveillance, ship-based radars, satellites, and airborne platforms fed the track into a shared operational picture. By the time the drones left the coastline, they were no longer mysterious. They were objects inside a kill chain. That is the first layer, find. Finding matters because the earlier a drone is detected, the more options the defender has. A drone detected late near a ship may force a frantic last-second response, can be tracked, classified, assigned, and engaged with the most appropriate tool. More importantly, the launch location itself becomes part of the target picture. If the defender knows where the drone came from, the defender can begin asking what radar guided it, what coastal site prepared linked it, and what coastal site prepared the launch. This is where defense becomes offense. The drone is not the only target. The system that launched the drone is the real target. That is the second layer, suppression. The source emphasizes the EA-18G Growler's role because electronic warfare is one of the least visible but most decisive parts of modern combat. The public sees missiles, jets, explosions, and interception footage. It rarely sees the invisible fight over frequencies. But without that fight, everything else becomes harder. Iran's coastal radars and communications nodes are not simply pieces of hardware. They are the eyes and nerves of the IRGC's maritime campaign. They tell operators what is moving in the strait. They help cue drones. They help coordinate launches. They help build the tactical picture that lets Iran threaten shipping without having to control the entire waterway physically. Blind those systems and the IRGC's ability to act coherently declines. Electronic warfare does not have to destroy a radar to make it useless in the moment. It can jam, confuse, delay, spoof, overload, or deny confidence. A radar operator who does not trust his screen cannot coordinate effectively. A command relay that cannot pass a clean signal cannot support a launch package. A communications tower under electronic pressure becomes less useful even before a bomb hits it. That is why the Growler matters. It does not just protect American aircraft. It degrades Iran's ability to understand the attack that is coming. The source describes Iranian radar feeds as American aircraft, and loitering munitions move toward coastal radar nodes at Goruk, Keshem Island, and a communications relay at Civic. Whether every operational detail is later publicly confirmed or not, the tactical idea is clear. The U.S. did not merely intercept 4 drones and call it a day. It used the drone attack as justification and opportunity to strike the coastal surveillance architecture behind it. That is the punchback layer. And that layer is what makes the exchange strategically damaging for Iran. If Iran fires drones and loses them, that is bad. If Iran fires drones, loses them, and then loses the radar and communications nodes that helped enable the launch, that is much worse. That is the deliberate subtraction pattern. Every Iranian attack becomes a transaction. Iran spends drones. America spends low-cost defensive shots. Then America destroys the more expensive, harder-to-replace Iranian infrastructure behind the attack. Iran's visible weapon dies first. Its hidden support network is hit second. The balance of the transaction becomes devastating. This is why the 4-drone sortie matters even though the number is small. Early in the conflict, Iran could launch much larger salvos. A 4-drone attack suggests either caution, depletion, testing, or reduced capacity. None of those are signs of strength. If a force once used mass and now uses small packets, analysts have to ask why. Is Iran saving inventory? Has production slowed? Are launch sites being degraded? Are command nodes under pressure? Are operators afraid of larger salvos revealing more infrastructure? Are they probing for weaknesses rather than trying for decisive effect? Every possibility suggests that the campaign has changed. A small drone attack can still be dangerous. 1 drone can kill people or damage a ship, but as a strategic pressure tool, 4 drones are not the same as a mass swarm. A mass swarm tests the system. A small sortie tests the edges. And if even that small sortie is detected, intercepted, and followed by strikes on the supporting radar network, the message to Iranian planners is brutal. You cannot even probe without paying a price. That changes behavior. The third layer is cheap defeat. This is where APICs and similar low-cost counter-drone tools enter the story. The important point is not the exact cost of each individual shot, because costs vary depending on configuration, procurement, platform, and accounting. The important point is the shift in class. The defender is no longer automatically answering a cheap drone with an elite missile. The defender is building a menu of lower-cost responses. That menu is what Iran did not want. Iran wanted the U.S. to face a binary choice, waste expensive missiles or absorb hits. Instead, the U.S. is building intermediate layers. Fighter aircraft can carry larger numbers of lower-cost guided rockets for drone hunting. Directed energy systems can reduce marginal shot costs even further when conditions allow. Electronic warfare can disrupt command links, navigation, or sensors. Drones can be used. The defensive architecture becomes dense, flexible, and economically rational. This matters because magazine depth is not only about money, it is also about endurance. A destroyer cannot fire unlimited SM-2s or SM-6s. A Patriot battery cannot fire infinite PAC-3 interceptors. THAAD interceptors are scarce and expensive. If cheap drones can force those weapons to be spent, Iran gains advantage even when the drones die. But if cheap drones are killed by cheaper weapons, the high-end magazine is preserved. That is the fourth layer, expensive reserve. On a mine. The expensive interceptors are saved for ballistic missiles, the threats they were designed to defeat. When Iran fired 7 ballistic missiles at Kuwait and Bahrain, those high-end systems became relevant. Ballistic missiles move at speeds and trajectories that cheap rockets and guns cannot solve in the same way. That is where Aegis, Patriot, and THAAD belong. The system's intelligence lies in not wasting those weapons earlier. This is what layered defense actually means. Not use everything. Use the right thing at the right time. If a drone can be defeated by APKWS, guns, lasers, or electronic warfare, save the big missile. If a ballistic missile threatens a base, use the expensive interceptor. If a missile's trajectory shows it will hit open desert, do not waste an interceptor at all. That last point is especially important because restraint is part of efficiency. A mature defensive network does not merely shoot, it decides when not to shoot. The source claims that the 7th Iranian missile was assessed early enough as not requiring an interceptor. If accurate, that detail is more significant than it sounds. It means the system did not simply react in panic. It tracked, calculated, evaluated, and conserved. That is the mark of a defense architecture that has learned from repeated engagements. A less mature system fires at everything. A mature system discriminates. Discrimination saves inventory. Inventory saves endurance. Endurance shapes strategy. That brings us to Iran's victory announcement, the most revealing element of the entire exchange. After 4 drones failed to reach their targets, after 6 missiles were intercepted, after a 7th failed to matter, after coastal radar and communications nodes were struck, Iranian officials still framed the day as a victory. On the surface, this is propaganda. But the deeper question is whether the propaganda is merely external, or whether it has begun to contaminate internal decision-making. There are 2 possibilities. The first possibility is that Iran's leadership understands the operational reality perfectly, but lies publicly to preserve morale. In this version, the victory announcements are deliberate theater. The IRGC knows the drones failed. It knows the missiles were intercepted. It knows the radar network was hit. But it cannot admit failure because the regime's domestic legitimacy depends on the appearance of resistance. So it declares victory after every exchange, not because it believes the claim, but because it must keep the population, loyalists, and military institutions emotionally aligned with the resistance narrative. That is dangerous but rational. The second possibility is worse. The second possibility is that the information environment inside the institution is becoming so distorted that commanders and political advisors are receiving a filtered version of events. If every failed attack is described as proof of steadfastness, if survival itself becomes victory, if the act of launching is treated as success regardless of impact, then the command structure loses the feedback mechanism that allows strategy to change. That is operationally toxic. A military organization must be able to say, this did not work. Without that sentence, it cannot adapt. It can only repeat. If a drone attack fails but is called victory, the lesson is not learned. If a missile salvo misses but is called victory, the planners are not corrected. If radar nodes are destroyed but the public report emphasizes resistance, leadership may underestimate the cost of repetition. This is how forces deplete themselves. Not because they cannot see loss, but because they cannot admit loss. The source's concept of institutional survival as victory is powerful. It suggests that the IRGC may measure success less by military outcome than by endurance. If the regime survives another day, it is resisted. If it fires missiles and the government remains standing afterward, it has demonstrated will. If drones are shot down but the flag is still flying, propaganda converts failure into steadfastness. That framework can sustain morale. It cannot win an exchange rate war, because the United States is not measuring the same thing. It is measuring inventory, radar nodes, communications towers, missile stocks, launch sites, command links, and cost per engagement. Iran says, we resisted. The American system says, 4 drones removed, 6 missiles removed, radar degraded, command relay hit, no casualties. Those are different scoreboards. The scoreboard that matters operationally is not the one announced on state television. It is the one recorded in inventory databases. That is why this exchange matters so much. The IRGC can declare victory, but it cannot recover the drones. It can celebrate resistance, but it cannot unfire the missiles. It can insist THAAD is exhausted, but if bases remain undamaged and interceptors keep functioning, the claim has no operational weight. It can call the strike symbolic, but if the coastal radar picture is degraded, the next launch becomes harder. Reality keeps accounting. Every war has 2 narratives, the one leaders tell and the one logistics tells. Logistics is colder. It counts what remains. How many missiles are left? How many drones are left? How many engines? How much propellant? How many radar nodes? How many trained crews? How many communications relays? How many launchers? How many functioning roads? How many repair teams? How much money? The side that lies to itself about logistics eventually runs out of lies. The June 9 exchange shows that Iran is spending physical capability to generate political pressure. The question is whether the political pressure is worth the physical cost. So far, based on the source's framing, the answer appears to be no. They are not forcing major U.S. concessions. They are not shutting down the strait. They are not breaking Gulf state alignment. They are not reversing the blockade. They are not rescuing Iran's bargaining position. Instead, they are giving the United States repeated chances to subtract Iranian military capacity. That is the deliberate subtraction frame. Each exchange removes something. On a drone sortie removes drones. On a missile salvo removes missiles. On a radar-guided launch exposes radar. On a drone command relay exposes communications towers. On a ballistic missile attack reveals launch patterns. On a failed claim reveals information weakness. The United States does not have to destroy Iran in one decisive blow if Iran continues offering pieces of its force in small packages that fail to achieve strategic effect. Over time, the board empties. This is where the transcript's gambling metaphor becomes useful. Iran is playing chips, but the chips are not its towers, fuel, launch vehicles, trained crews, command nodes, and political credibility. Every attack places chips on the table. If the attack fails, the chips are gone. If the response destroys supporting infrastructure, Iran loses more than it wagered. If the public calls it victory anyway, the next round may be placed with the same bad odds. That is not strategy. That is compulsion. The Russia-Ukraine dimension reinforces the point. The Shahed-type drone has been tested at enormous scale in Ukraine. Russia has used large drone and missile salvos against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Ukraine, in response, has spent years developing practical methods for defeating such threats at sustainable cost. That battlefield has become the world's laboratory for cheap drone warfare, layered defense, mobile intercept teams, electronic warfare, sensor fusion, and cost discipline. The United States has been watching. CENTCOM's counter-drone architecture over Hormuz is not emerging from theory alone. It is part of a global learning cycle. Ukraine absorbs and adapts. The Red Sea teaches another set of lessons. Israel's experience teaches another. U.S. forces in the Middle East integrate the lessons into their own platforms and doctrine. Then Iran's drones enter the Strait and face a defensive system that has already studied their cousins for years. The Shahed is not a mystery anymore. That matters. A weapon's power declines when its behavior becomes familiar. The sound, speed, altitude, engine signature, flight profile, navigation tendencies, launch patterns, and vulnerabilities all become part of the defender's library. The first time a drone appears, it can shock. The 1000th time, it is still dangerous, but it is also known. Known threats are easier to price. Known threats are easier to layer against. Known threats are easier to defeat cheaply. That is why Iran's drone strategy is losing some of its original surprise value. The platform still has value. It can still kill, it can still overwhelm weak defenses. It can still force difficult choices if launched en masse. But against a defender that has built a layered architecture around exactly this threat, the old cost advantage shrinks. This is also why Iran's use of small salvos is revealing. A 4-drone attack does not overwhelm a mature layered system. It may test it, it may probe for a hole, it may seek a lucky hit. But if the defender finds, tracks, assigns, kills, and then counterstrikes, the probe fails and the attacker learns an unpleasant lesson. Even small attacks now cost infrastructure. That is how deterrence shifts. Not because Iran becomes incapable of launching anything, but because each launch becomes less profitable. The transcript also references a broader American air power signal, including the alleged appearance of next-generation aircraft development. Whether any particular sighting is confirmed or not, the strategic point is valid. Iran is trying to rebuild defenses against the force that exists today, while the United States is developing the force that will exist tomorrow. That gap matters. Air defense systems are expensive, slow to procure, and difficult to integrate. If they are repeatedly destroyed, jammed, or bypassed while the attacker moves toward more advanced stealth, autonomy, sensor fusion, the defender faces a moving target. Iran cannot simply restore yesterday's radar network and call the problem solved. Yesterday's radar network was already being blinded. That is the deeper modernization challenge for Tehran. Every time Iran rebuilds a coastal radar node, the United States learns how it is rebuilt. Every time Iran restores a communications relay, the U.S. maps it again. Every time Iran imports or integrates Russian or Chinese components, those components enter the electronic order of battle. Every time the node activates, it risks detection. Every time it supports a drone attack, it risks destruction. This is why rebuilding under surveillance is so hard. You can repair the object. You cannot easily restore mystery. The blockade and strike campaign have turned Iran's military architecture into a repeatedly observed system. That matters as much as physical damage. A radar that is known, mapped, characterized, and repeatedly jammed is less threatening than a radar whose parameters are unknown. A launch site that has been watched through multiple cycles is less dangerous than one that appears suddenly. A communications tower that has already been tied to drone operations becomes a candidate for immediate retaliation. The conflict is producing an intelligence map. The U.S. does not merely destroy. It learns. That learning is cumulative. Day 1 teaches one pattern. Day 30 teaches adaptation. Day 60 teaches repair cycles. Day 101 teaches which systems Iran still trusts under pressure. Every failed Iranian attack adds data. Every counterstrike adds confirmation. Every propaganda claim adds insight into the regime's information needs. That is why this war is so dangerous for Iran even when its attacks do not cause casualties. A failed attack can still expose a network. A failed missile can still reveal guidance reliability. A failed drone sortie can still reveal launch timing. A failed propaganda line can still reveal institutional anxiety. Failure becomes intelligence. That is the trap. Mine. The source also points to the economic crisis behind the military exchange. Blockade pressure, currency collapse, inflation, loss of oil revenue, criminal smuggling to demand tied to negotiations. Some of those claims require careful verification, but the analytical framework is clear. Iran's military pressure is being used as a bargaining instrument because the regime needs relief. Drones and missiles are not being launched only for military reasons. They are political messages with warheads. But a bargaining chip must create leverage. If every chip is intercepted, destroyed, or counterproductive, the bargaining strategy weakens. Iran's demand does not become stronger because it fired missiles that failed. It becomes weaker if the failed attack shows that Iranian stockpiles are declining, defenses are being suppressed, and the United States can absorb the salvo without changing its position. That is the nightmare scenario for Tehran, spending leverage without buying concessions. The next 90 days, as the source suggests, are therefore not about whether Iran can keep firing at all. It likely can. A depleted arsenal is not an empty arsenal. A weakened drone network is not a dead drone network. A damaged radar picture is not total blindness. Iran can still cause harm. It can still launch. It can still hit if something slips through. It can still escalate through proxies, mines, cyber operations, or attacks on shipping. The question is whether continued firing improves Iran's position faster than it depletes Iran's capacity. That is a much harder question. If Iran fires slowly, it may preserve inventory but fail to create pressure. If it fires heavily, it may create more pressure but deplete faster and expose more launch infrastructure. If it stops firing, it may preserve capability but lose the narrative of resistance. If it escalates, it may invite more devastating strikes. Every option is ugly. That is what successful pressure creates, not immediate surrender, but a narrowing of useful choices. The United States appears to be trying to make every Iranian military option less attractive. Drones are intercepted selectively, radars are jammed and struck, communications towers are hit, launch infrastructure is watched, maritime routes are tracked, oil revenue is pressured. Diplomacy remains available, but on terms shaped by the battlefield. That is the architecture of coercion. Iran's counter is endurance. Survive each round. Declare victory. Maintain internal loyalty. Preserve enough missile and drone capability to keep the adversary cautious. Demand money, sanctions relief, or political concessions. Use every failed attack as evidence of will rather than as evidence of weakness. That counter can work if the opponent tires first. It fails if the opponent has built a system that becomes more efficient with every exchange. That is why the cost curve matters so much. If the United States had to spend millions every time Iran spent thousands, Iran could sustain pressure. But if the United States spends roughly comparable or lower amounts against drones, preserves expensive interceptors for ballistic missiles, and destroys radar nodes in response, then Iran's endurance model deteriorates. The economics of resistance change. A resistance strategy depends on affordable defiance. When defiance becomes expensive and ineffective, the strategy becomes symbolic. Symbolism can sustain politics for a time. It cannot replace inventory. The June 9 exchange, therefore, should be read as a warning about Iran's future, not merely a report about one morning. 4 drones down, coastal radar struck, communications degraded, 7 missiles fired, 6 intercepted, 1 failed. No decisive U.S. concession, no shipping paralysis, no major American casualties. Iranian victory claims continue. That is not escalation dominance by Tehran. That is a shrinking return on force. If this pattern continues, Iran's military will still be dangerous, but the regime's ability to translate danger into political leverage will decline. It will keep spending to be heard. The United States will keep listening, killing, mapping, and subtracting. Gulf states will watch whether the U.S. defense holds. Markets will watch whether ships keep moving. Negotiators will watch whether Tehran's demands soften as its stockpiles decline. The most important audience may be inside Iran's own command structure. At some point, someone has to ask whether the victory announcements are helping or harming strategic judgment. If the IRGC knows the operations are failing and lies only to the public, then it may still change privately. If it has begun to believe its own narrative, then the danger increases because institutions that cannot interpret failure accurately tend to repeat failure until reality imposes a harsher correction. That is where the war becomes psychological. Can Iran admit to itself that 4 drones did not matter? Can it admit that 7 missiles did not change the equation? Can it admit that a radar network that keeps going dark is not an effective shield? Can it admit that the cost curve is turning against the swarm? Can it admit that every victory is costing it pieces of the very arsenal it needs for the next round? Or does the regime's survival narrative require every failed attack to become proof that resistance continues? This is the question that will decide whether Iran adapts or bleeds itself. On my end, there is still room for Tehran to change course. It could reduce attacks, preserve inventory, accept a deal, seek relief, and rebuild quietly. It could decide that the military exchange is no longer producing leverage. It could use the remaining arsenal as deterrence rather than as disposable pressure. That would be a rational move if the leadership believes survival is more important than spectacle. But hardline institutions rarely abandon spectacle easily. They have built careers, myths, and internal authority around resistance. They may prefer a failing strategy that preserves ideological identity over pragmatic retreat that looks like surrender. That is why the next phase remains dangerous. A cornered force with declining returns may still lash out. In fact, it may not do not matter, try 40. If 4 drones do not matter, try 40. If 7 missiles do not matter, try a larger salvo. If radars are being struck, use mobile launchers. If ships are defended, attack something softer. If direct pressure fails, use proxies. That is the escalation risk. A failing strategy does not always die quietly. Sometimes it becomes more reckless. That is why the American layered architecture must remain disciplined. Cheap drone defeat is essential, but overconfidence would be dangerous. Ballistic missile defense must conserve interceptors, but not underreact. Punchback strikes must degrade launch networks, but not accidentally create escalation beyond political control. Electronic warfare must blind the enemy, but intelligence must keep monitoring for adaptation. Diplomacy must remain open enough to turn military pressure into an exit. The goal cannot be endless subtraction for its own sake. The goal is to make continued aggression less attractive than a settlement. That is the difference between coercion and drift. Coercion uses force to create a decision. Drift simply repeats exchanges until something breaks. If the United States has built the architecture described in the source, then it has military momentum. The question is whether that momentum is being tied to a political outcome. Because no air defense system, no laser, no growler, no radar strike, and no missile interceptor can replace strategy. They can create conditions. Leaders still have to use them. The June 9 exchange created a clear condition. Iran's current pressure tools are losing efficiency. Drones are being killed cheaply. Missiles are being intercepted or allowed to fail when they pose no threat. Coastal infrastructure is being struck when it supports attacks. The propaganda narrative is increasingly detached from tactical results. The cost of continuing rises. The benefit of continuing falls. That is the shape of a collapsing pressure economy. Iran can still fight. But every fight is starting to cost more than it returns. And that is why this morning matters. Not because 4 drones were shot down. Not because 7 missiles failed to produce strategic effect. Not even because radar nodes went dark. It matters because the entire exchange revealed the new logic of the battlefield. Iran launches. America sees. America jams. America kills cheaply. America saves expensive interceptors. America strikes the network. Iran declares victory. Then the ledger updates. The drones are gone. The missiles are gone. The radars are damaged. The communications relay is hit. The ships keep moving. The U.S. position does not collapse. That ledger is the truth beneath the propaganda. And in wars of attrition, ledgers decide what speeches cannot. The drones are down. The radar picture is weaker. The missiles did not deliver the pressure Iran needed. The cost curve is moved. The board is emptier than it was yesterday. Iran can keep calling that victory. But the battlefield is counting something else.